So I'm going to do that. Uh-oh, I lost my screen sharing. Here it is. All right, I'm going to minimize this. And there we go. Is that, can everybody kind of see that pretty clearly?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so as Steve mentioned, we met, gosh, I don't even know how many years ago it is, but I heard that there was a Tremulous project in my good friend Rob Ida's shop, and took full advantage.
I think the audio may have just cut out.
Yes,
Yeah.
here we go. Sorry, I think it muted everybody, including me again. All right, so can everybody hear me? Well, I'm going to assume that people can hear me. So we're going to talk today. Steve gave us a little bit of a preview into what we're going to talk about, but essentially we're going to talk about how we go about remaking some of the components and things for a Tucker car, and maybe a little bit about the approach to trying to take on the restoration of one of these things. It's quite a bit different from your normal kind of everyday production car, and it presents quite a few interesting challenges as a result. So we will start with just a little bit about the Tucker story, and talking to Steve, it sounds like most of you at least are familiar with the Tucker. But in essence, the Tucker Corporation existed from about 1944 to 1949. But within that period, there was really only 2 years that they were working on both design and production of what we call the 50 production cars. And as Steve mentioned before, this was a monumental effort. So they had over 200 engineers on staff. There's 50,000 blueprints that cover all the parts to these cars. So this was no kind of fly-by-night operation. I think a lot of the people that have seen the movie kind of see that, there's a group of like 10 or 15 folks there, but it was they had more than 2,000 employees. So it was a big operation. Total production of Tucker cars was 51, including the prototype Tin Goose, which is a little bit different from the others. And in general, we, I guess those of us in the Tucker world refer to the 50 Tucker cars as the production Tuckers, but they aren't really production, and we'll see that here coming up. All of the body panels and things were made on prototype stampings, most of them being either wood hammer forms or Kirkside dies or stuff like that. So the body panels themselves, especially as you get into some of the later cars, were close, but not that close. So we end up spending quite a bit of time trying to preserve what's left over from body fabrication, and that's where we're going to start today. So this first picture is the pseudo Tucker pilot production line, and you can see a whole bunch of guys there cutting up bodies, and a lot of these guys are putting lead on and smoothing it out, and that's where we start. So at the beginning of a Tucker restoration, this particular car that we see in the pictures is Tucker number 44. This is one we did in 2018. The first thing we do is kind of assess what the condition of the body is relative to the lead body filler that they used. So it's a process similar to like soldering or something along those lines, where you're using a flux to make the two dissimilar metals stick together, and it is an acidic process. So as a result, if you don't fully neutralize the the flux that's underneath there, you end up with crevice corrosion issues, which ends up being quite a big problem along the way. So not only were they rough body stampings, you end up with some pretty significant issues where you're going to end up with just no metal left over. So the first thing in these first couple pictures here, you see is stripping the car down to bare metal, and then all those kind of different colored areas you see there is where all the lead is, and there is a lot of it. A Tucker body has, on average, about 200 pounds of lead in it, so it's quite a bit of work to try to evaluate and see where things need to go and where things need to stay. So the first thing we do is kind of make a bunch of inspection holes. And on this one, it was pretty clear right off the bat that we had some pretty significant corrosion issues under the lead. You can see, the rust that's starting to form on all these panels and things. So that becomes something we need to take care of. One thing I'll kind of point out on the right-hand side here is you can see just how thick this lead is. So especially around the door openings and where the fenders meet the doors and things, there is usually at least a half an inch of lead in there. So it becomes an issue when we're putting them back together of what do we do with that big gap, and how do we deal with the sheet metal that's there? And we'll talk a little bit about that. So this is some more pictures of, so this is post lead removal. And it kind of, this is the point that it gets pretty scary if you're working on one of these things, especially for this first time. It almost looks sometimes like they've been involved in an accident, but in fact, this is just kind of how they made them. You can see a lot of it's just rough, like hammer work, where they're just bashing in the sheet metal and then slapping a whole bunch of lead over it to kind of get it close to the body contour they're looking for. This is Tucker 44 on the left-hand side. The center picture is Tucker number 29, which is we actually have in our shop right now. And you can see they literally just hit it with a hammer until it was down far enough, and they just kind of filled it full of lead. Around the door openings and things up here on the right-hand side, you can see it just becomes a real challenge to deal with. Luckily, we've got a gentleman on our team, and I should mention that I don't do these things by myself. We work with Rob Ida and Bob Ida, who own Ida Automotive in New Jersey, and they're kind of this is where the restoration itself is hosted. And Rob is probably one of the best people I've ever seen as far as metal work and body work and things like that go. He's able to take these cars and make really good assessments and repairs and replacements where we need, and certainly couldn't do this without those guys. Couple more pictures of some more lead areas. You could see in this one, they bashed it so hard that they actually poked through the sheet metal and then just kind of covered it up with lead. And same thing in the front area. This is where the fender would bolt on. It's you could see just repeatedly hit in with a hammer until it got it far enough to just throw some lead on it. So the overall point here is not necessarily to bash how they put these cars together. They were really trying to do these things quickly and get to a point where they could evaluate different parts and shapes and things. And this was never intended to be the production version. But as we try to save and maintain these cars these days, it becomes an issue that we have to deal with. So we'll get a little bit off of the topic of the bodies and things themselves and talk a little bit about Tucker parts. Oh, actually, I have one more slide on picture. So this is that same area on Tucker 44 after we've made some repairs and recontoured sheet metal to kind of fit in there. So depending on what the owner wants to use the car for, we end up adjusting the amount of body filler that goes in the car, because it's we don't want to try to over restore the car where it's something that it wasn't. But we also want to be cognizant of what the owner is going to use this car for. So in that, taking that into account, we have to make sure that we're putting out a product that's going to last, and the overall idea to represent what a Tucker design would have been, and also make sure that it's going to be around for another 50 to 100 years or even longer. So the picture on the right is just before the body shell itself. This is Tucker number 44. Goes in the paint booth for filler, and you can see we've left a lot of the roughness on the inside of the fender wells and thing, and that's on purpose, because again, we're not trying to erase history. We're trying to maintain kind of how they went together, but also present them in a light that lets everybody know what the design looked like. So what do you do when you need parts? So the sheet metal is something that we can kind of fabricate at a new metal, but there's particular components that we need, mechanical things and suspension parts and interior things, where many of those parts are Tucker specific. So unfortunately, the room of parts there that we see on the right does not exist, and we can't just run down to our local Tucker dealer and pick up some parts. The picture on the left you see there is actually from a company called Air Cooled Motors in Syracuse, New York, that produced the Tucker engine. They made about 100 of them, and even there, even though those were done on kind of they were based off a relatively production design, there's a lot of Tucker specific pieces there that if you're missing them, it's you got to make them. There's almost no other option. So in some cases, for things like bearings and wear items and spark plugs, a lot of those things were off the shelf items and usually used by other manufacturers. So in those cases, we're able to secure, well, at least currently, we're able to secure NOS items, and in some cases even new manufacturer items to take care of some of those wear items. But the Tucker specific parts are the ones that are a real challenge. So what we're going to talk about is the approach we've taken to a couple case studies on a number of different parts we've produced over the years, and we'll kind of walk you through how we went about doing them and getting information and those sorts of things. So the first thing that we do is we go to find the instruction manual. So as Steve mentioned, the AACA Museum in Hershey, Pennsylvania has almost all of the blueprints that were created to make the Tucker car. And we spent a lot of time researching different components, but even within a different component, where in the design of that part it would have ended up on an individual Tucker car. So and a lot of them they're almost like art. I put a couple of them in the presentation here, but you're going through them, and I mean, these are all drawn by hand, right? This is way before the days of CAD, and going through these, I could just spend hours and hours and hours, and I do, honestly. But it's pretty neat to see the amount of work that would go into some of these designs. So just because there's a blueprint does not necessarily mean that that's the part that kind of ended up on an individual car. And that's really what kind of a lot of the challenges is. We end up with what we think is, oh, hey, we've got a design for this, and it's going to be as easy as just, trying to find somebody to make this thing. But in a lot of cases, that's just not reality. We end up, the part that's actually on the car, or that we found by researching other cars, ends up being something completely different, and we end up having to do even more research to find out what the right thing is for a particular car. But the blueprints and drawings and things go down to, I mean, the nut and bolt level. Every single washer, nut, bolt at least has some attempt at a drawing. So even if we can't find the exact shape, we can usually find something similar that will get us at least a path to a set of engineering specifications to produce parts. I should mention the AACA Museum I did before, but they are very accommodating in letting us be a part of trying to remake and restore and keep these cars kind of relevant. And they've been quite gracious in allowing us access to these blueprints and things over the years. So the other thing we do is we look at other cars. So there's not a whole lot of original, fully original Tuckers out there, really none, except one, which exists in the Henry Ford Museum. That car it's not fully, it wasn't taken directly from the factory and put into the museum. It was actually purchased by the Detroit News to defend themselves against a libel suit brought by Preston Tucker after the demise of the corporation. And after they were done kind of using it to try to defend themselves, it got donated to the Henry Ford Museum, and that was in the late 1950s. So it has had some paint work and some mechanical work and some changes made, but for the most part, it's the most intact kind of production Tucker. So when we're looking at, what should something appear like, that's the car we go to first. But the difficulty is, even though there was only 50 cars, each one is almost unique. It is kind of unique on its own. So they were trying all kinds of different engineering changes and design changes and different things. So just because this, kind of one car exists that has an example of how things should have been, it just doesn't cover the whole gamut of how things are. The suspensions are, significantly different, and there's a whole bunch of things you just can't get. So the other piece that we do is we have a huge archive of pictures of every single car that we can gather kind of through the years of production. We do that by purchasing any of the old kind of Tucker factory photos we can find. We go back through all the original owners and everybody in between, and contacting their families to see what kind of pictures they have of different cars. So we've been able to compile a pretty good database by car of, what things appeared through the years. So in some instances, we can track a particular change to a particular owner and know that, hey, that's not something that happened at the factory on this particular car. It was added by this guy. But in some cases, it's if we can't determine that something's definitely not original and has all the characteristics that it might have been original, that's where we don't want to erase history. So it becomes a bit of a challenge to determine what the next step is there. So first kind of thing we're going to talk about is all of the original hardware and fasteners. as you can imagine, on an automobile, there are lots of them. And one of the things that Tucker did was they used a whole bunch of aircraft style aircraft grade fasteners and materials and manufacturers and things. And as a result, a lot of the markings and things on the bolts are quite unique, and also they're just different than a lot of things. The shapes and sizes and things like that are just a little bit strange. So we spend a whole heck of a lot of time when we take a car apart documenting locations and positions and styles and everything of every single different fastener on the car. And we've done enough of them that we can kind of compare them to each other to say, hey, this looks like it might be right. This looks like it might not be right. And in some cases, we end up with something, again, that's a little bit unique to a car. But rather than, kind of taking the easy route of just replacing it all with modern hardware, we literally refinish every single nut and bolt. So they get stripped of their, clean, stripped their original finish. And then we've developed a zinc finish of our own that kind of replaces the original cadmium finish. So, you guys are in California, so you're probably familiar with cadmium being a fairly hazardous substance, or just generally. But it's not a great thing to get on your hands and things like that. So, when we first started doing our first bit of these, we got a plating system and set it up, and came up with our own plating chemistry and finish to represent cadmium in a zinc finish, so it's a little bit less hazardous. It's a phenomenal amount of work to do this for a single car, but you can't really replace it, right? So we could take the whole batch of fasteners and send it off to a plating company, which we've not done on Tucker's, but we do this on other cars, and you end up missing things and they get mixed up, and it's for something like this where some of these things are just irreplaceable. It's a heck of a lot of time, but this is kind of the best way to go about it. So that's probably the least exciting thing we're going to talk about. But the next thing we look at is rubber parts, and there'll be a couple different categories of this. So the rubber on a Tucker is somewhat special in a lot of different places. So one of the things that Tucker is famous for, and that they had as one of their safety innovations, is that if you get into an accident, the front windshield will pop out of its gasket and save the driver from running their head into a piece of glass. So what you find on, just over it's 70 years of use and things, that most of the rubber is if you've got to remove a window, it basically just falls apart. So the cars that do have their original rubber, it's almost impossible to reuse. And then a lot of the cars that have kind of traveled through their lives and had multiple restorations, somebody's put something else in there that either doesn't appear correct or certainly doesn't function correct. So we go about the task of retooling and remaking all these different rubber pieces. So we use a process very similar to probably what most people use, and probably Tucker used. We make extrusion dies for these and come up with a rubber compound that is based off the blueprints. And we're able to remake door gaskets, window gaskets, tail light gaskets, all kinds of things that you need to restore these cars. And the last thing on the bottom here is as you can imagine, with a production run of 50 cars, there is no economy of scale for any of this stuff. So you end up having to get pretty creative on finding manufacturers that are, number one, even willing to work with you at all, and then being able to produce these at some cost that's not just crazy astronomical to make it make sense. So we spend quite a bit of time working with vendor partners for that sorts of stuff too. All right, glass markings. So this is something that I threw this in here just kind of to show the level of detail that we kind of get down to on these things. But one of the things we spent quite a bit of time, especially when we were preparing for Pebble Beach, is looking at all the different logos and markings and dates and things on all the different parts that are on Tuckers. And one of the things that we focused on was the markings on the glass. So this was the original manufacturer of the glass was PPG, Pittsburgh Plate Glass, and we were able to find, actually through a restoration that had been done previously where they saved the old original windows, we were able to duplicate the logo. So we took the window basically took a picture of the logo, blew it up into CAD, and then I spent too many hours kind of drawing the whole template for cutting it out. And then we machined a stencil out of, and we actually used a plastic shim stock with a little teeny 5,000 cent mill to make sure that all the corners and things were as small as we could make them. And then that allowed us to mark all the different pieces of glass appropriately. So in the past, again, this is something that either just gets left off or somebody else's logo gets stuck on there. But it was something we took the time to do for Pebble Beach. This is probably the most difficult part that I personally have had to make for the Tucker. It is the gauge surround that goes around the speedometer and cluster right around the steering wheel. This is a part that was originally made out of lucite, and it really just doesn't survive. So early Tucker cars have the radios mounted kind of behind this panel here. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but you end up this thing gets cracked and warped and things over the years, so it ends up having to be remade. So we took a little bit of a different route with this one. So a lot of times, we're using a lot of modern technology of 3D printing and all things like that. But in this case, it would have been a very difficult part to get to the level of finish that we needed by using at least the traditional or the 3D printing we had at our disposal. So in this case, I took an original and kind of fixed it. So it was kind of all broken up in a bunch of cracked up pieces and stuff, but I glued it all back together and then wet sanded and polished it up to the point where it was presentable. You could still see all the imperfections in it, so it wasn't usable at that point, but it did give me a piece that I could then make a silicone mold from, which you can see up there on the top left. And then I was able to recast it out of clear urethane. So super difficult to get it to the level where it's completely water clear and transparent. So I actually learned how to do this on our first Tucker restoration because there was nobody that would do it for us. But it was a painful process, but the end product was really kind of worth it because I've been able to use this in, I don't know, almost, well, it's getting close to 10 Tuckers at this point where there was just kind of no other solution. And now there's a piece that we can use to fix them. So not only the casting process is hard on this thing, but it's even after I get it out of the mold, it takes, I don't know, a good 20 hours of hand finishing to polish it up to the point where it's usable. And then the gold color that you see in there comes from painting the back of it. And it kind of shows to the front. There is a couple of different versions of these. So the one that you can see kind of down this number 8 chair here, early Tuckers have white bars painted in them, and that's what this one represents. So we were able to do that. This one was actually for Tucker number 2, which is out in California with you guys. So plastic knobs. This is another one that is a Tucker specific piece. So many of the interior knobs were made specifically for Tucker. And not only that, there's multiple different versions of them depending on which car you end up with. So we refer to this particular switch as the Lollipop. And if I go back one slide here, you can see them up on the left-hand side here. But essentially the first lever is the exterior lights. The second lever is the center Cyclops headlight. The third one is the heater, and the last one is defrost. So for this particular one, took a little different approach than the previous slide in that I made CAD models based off the original blueprint, and actually I had some original pieces that were in rough shape, but I was able to model them to create the real shape. And then, on these ones, we ended up using a 3D printer, which we also have in-house. This is an SLA technology printer. So it's a stereolithography, which is a liquid polymer that is, it's a thermoset plastic that is basically cured with a laser, but you're able to get like really good surface finishes and really fine details. So that, the engraving that you see in those knobs, I'm actually able to print that in so that we don't have to try to machine each individual, letter into the knob. So all these little support structures and things here are a kind of a part of the 3D printing process. So this is what attaches it to the build plate. It actually prints upside down and kind of grows out of a liquid vat. So every spot where one of those is, obviously to get a good part, you got to sand it off and polish and things like that. So it takes a whole bunch of time to get it to a part where you can actually cast from. And that's what you see on the bottom left-hand side. This has gone through a finishing process, at least to get it to the point where it's relatively shiny. You can see all the different spouts and things. So this is actually upside down from how I would actually pour it. So this will get silicone into it, flipped upside down, and then it gets a metal insert and the plastic is cast around it. The bottom right are the finished pieces. So there's all 4 of the lollipops in there. And there's also the air mix and fresh air pull knobs, which go right below these, which also, these have some pretty fancy machine shafts on that you can't really see, but that's another one we use. I guess the point being here, you kind of have to use a whole bunch of different technologies in order to be able to make this stuff at low volume, and we take advantage of every single one that we can. So that is that one. This slide is just a couple other pictures of other plastic knobs that we've made. You can see the hood knob there on the top left, and the center top is the CAD model of that. It's rendered in a rendering software, so it makes it look kind of real. The right-hand side is a Tucker lighter, which also has its own unique knob. We're able to secure NOS lighter elements and make the knobs so that we can make sure Tuckers aren't missing their lighters. It's well, I guess not surprisingly, since it's not connected to the car, that's one of the most common parts we end up getting requests for is the lighters, because they're almost always missing. The bottom left is the push button for the door, actually the door latch. So Tucker, one of the things they did was try to minimize anything that if you were trying to get out of the car that you would get your clothes or anything caught on. So instead of having levers and things, there's just a button that you push to get out. This was actually used later on a Willys Jeep design as well, but these are almost impossible to find in good shape, so we decided to remake them. The center bottom is door lock pulls, and this is there's at least 2 different styles of these. So again, you make one, and then somebody needs another set for an early car, and you end up making a whole nother set. But it's again is another Tucker specific item, and then the bottom right there is just kind of the in-process view of backfilling all the letters and things like that. Even the colors that we do for the backfill are, researched back to the blueprints. So this matches the color that was specified on the drawing for the backfill for these particular parts. So next one is the window crank levers. So these are, again, a Tucker specific design. Early cars do have a little bit different of a design that was used on other things, but later cars do have this special lever. This one is one I kind of threw in here because it kind of has a different technology where we had to cast parts in this case, and this is not something we've never done. We've had to make a number of different like cooling system castings and different things like that, but in this case we 3D printed the casting mold. And this is not something actually this is not one I do in-house. We had a vendor that was able to 3D print the molds for us and then cast these out of aluminum. And then I made the knobs that go kind of the same process we just talked about, the knob, the actual crank knob there. And then we also finished these back to their original specified finish, which is a satin chrome that you see in the far right-hand side there. This particular one we use a good friend of ours named Mark Lieberman, who owns a company called Nostalgic Motoring and has also owned about, I think he's up to 5 or 6 Tuckers at this point, not all at the same time, but he's a guy we work with quite a bit for trying to keep these things going. All right. Next part is another rubber part, but these are, in this case, it's rubber boots. So these end up being parts that they're a little different than the extrusion dies, just because a lot of this stuff is compression molded originally. And many of these get to the point where they're just too expensive to make tooling for. So we've kind of developed our own process to make these out of liquid urethane rubber, as opposed to making them out of natural rubber like it would have originally been. We're using the same kind of printing technology, which you see on the bottom, well, actually both of the left-hand sides here, to create the mold cores for these. And these are also done in silicone. So it's we're making the outside shape, and then there's also a printed insert that goes in that will represent the void that these kind of boots need to live in, right? So This is, I think the one on top here is a license plate boot. This will get clipped off and stuff and look just like the original one. And then the bottom here is these are used on both the clutch mechanism as well as the accelerator. And it's not something we can really use anything else for, because they also designed their own special ferrule that this end kind of connects to, the big end there. So if you don't have it, it's just kind of missing, and it's a heck of a lot of work to make this stuff. But if you don't have it, it just kind of looks incomplete. So I mentioned it before, but there's just so many of these things that are just so labor intensive to do. But when you kind of get everything together and see a finished car, it really pays off. So interior fabric. I threw this kind of one in there. You have to kind of be not an expert, but at least aware of so many different materials and things in order to respect one of these cars. So when we do a Tucker restoration, there's only about 2 or 3 cars that have their original interiors at all, and the ones that do are in pretty rough shape. So we end up remaking the fabric for the interior as well. There are 3 main interior colors. There's a green, a red, and a blue. We remake the wool broadcloth. The one you see in the center there is from Tucker number 44. And that's our interior guy, Bruce Devlin, who's probably the best interior guy in the world, or at least we think he is. But we take, again, like measurements on and on those original cars of all the stitching, where they stitch things, how big the pleats are, what style of threads they used, all that kind of crazy stuff to get to the most original representation of a Tucker interior that we possibly can. And we've also been able to, over the years, get a pretty good sample amongst different cars of confirming what the materials were. So for a long time, what ends up happening on these, and I'm sure other cars too, is it kind of ends up like a telephone game where nobody really knows technically what was original, and somebody does something, like in the 1950s, and then people just tend to copy that as the original. And that's a lot of what happened to Tucker interiors until up to about Pebble Beach, where we kind of went back and said, hey, we don't think this is quite right. And got to the point where we were able to represent, completely original interiors. The door panel that you see on the far right-hand side there looks pretty rough. That door panel is actually from Tucker number 27, which rolled at Indianapolis during the factory testing that was happening there, and ended up in Tucker number 2. And when they redid it, they uncovered that this was underneath there, and said, hey, do you guys want to have this part so you could use it? And we said, heck yeah, we do. So the nice thing about it is you can see just how much the colors and things fade, but in the stuff that was protected by trim and things, you can see the original blue. And actually, I'm using this right now we're remaking this blue broadcloth, and this is where we've kind of clipped our color samples from. So that's all I have for you today. This last picture, I think, Steve, this will look familiar to you because you have a very similar background. This is Pebble Beach in 2018. Tuckers were never really at Pebble Beach until then, and they had a special class just for Tuckers. So I don't remember exactly how many were there total, but quite a few. The one that we brought for an owner named Howard Kroplik out of New York is the second one in there on the left, the black one, and the green one, and the one that you're looking at straight on is Tucker number 16. Which is the one that's owned by Henry Ford Museum and is still mostly original. So they were able to send that out to the show. So pretty special event for us, and hopefully we'll be back there again someday. So I am going to stop sharing. All right.
Well, Sean, I guess one question I'd have for you is, how long does that whole process take? Like for number 44, which you spent an awful lot of time on, from the time you get the car until the time you ship it off to be viewed at Pebble Beach, what kind of time frame does that take?
Well, it's relative. So in the case of Tucker 44, we had a extremely compressed timeline just because of the timing of Pebble Beach. So I remind the owner of this all the time, but we quoted him originally about a 3-year project to do the whole car. And we ended up completing it in 8 months. So it was very, very quick. And it's not that it didn't take 3 years. We just did it in 8 months. So it was a lot of long hours and sleepless nights and things like that to get it done.
Do you ever buy an old car to restore it and sell it for yourselves?
Sometimes. I mean, it's restoration work in general is at least from our perspective, it's so time and labor intensive that for your kind of normal everyday available car, it's really hard to be able to put that much effort in and still kind of make a decent buck if you're doing it to the level that we do. We probably do more buying and selling of cars kind of as is than we do restoring them to a level like this. So
what do you charge for this per car?
do you have a Tucker you're looking to get restored?
No.
It depends. It's not inexpensive. I mean, the nice thing about Tuckers is they're worth a fair bit of money. I think the last one that sold which needed work went for about $2 million. So in general, if you're doing a full restoration like this, you're going to be in probably more than $500,000 to get it kind of up to that level. But it depends on the particular car. We don't really do so. There's kind of a whole nother part of the industry that does kind of auction preps and things like that. That's kind of a lower budget kind of amount of work, but that's not really kind of the work that we do. We're more interested in kind of going all the way or nothing. So it ends up having to be a pretty special customer to be able to take on a project like that. Now, that being said, for Tuckers at least, it's not a terrible investment, right? So even looking at the amount of money you're putting into it versus how much a restoration costs, in general, the car's still worth more than that at the end. So it doesn't end up being a complete loser that if you were doing this to a normal everyday car.
How did you handle during the restoration process the toxic material of lead and cadmium and all the rest that didn't affect your workers in the long term?
Yeah, so the lead is kind of melted out manually, and it's other than kind of doing it outside and collecting everything that's there, that's kind of the as far as that goes. The cadmium we remove chemically so that we're not creating. So some people media blast it, so it ends up airborne, and then the material. So it's a caustic process to get rid of it, and then that gets disposed of through a local hazardous waste material company here that takes care of the waste for us. So, but certainly a concern, right? There's almost like a reemergence of lead in the industry as people are remaking these cars and going, we should use lead again, which just to me seems like a terrible idea. Even the sanding of it and handling it just, it's obsolete for a reason, and it's not something I want all over me and my hands and all that stuff. So we're using all the PPE and things getting it out, but it's certainly a concern.
Yeah. Right. Where are you located?
I live in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, but the shop that where we base these out of is Ida Automotive, which is located in Morganville, New Jersey.
Okay. Thanks.
Someone has their hand up. You want to ask a question?
Sure. The two questions. The first question is, in terms of scaling your manufacturing up and down, because it's obviously very small scale.
Yeah.
Do you ever, in terms of planning, do you ever say, okay, I have to make this washer. I know there are this many Tuckers and I know this many restorers. Why don't I go ahead and up that up to a more, so I can get a better marginal cost on that. And then I can sell it. I either use it myself or sell it to some of the other, and even, as you said, there are different stages of prepping the car. So you may be able to market that. I don't know if that's possible. That's the first question. The other question is, it seems like back in the old days, there was a certain set of assumptions that when you put a blueprint and you gave that to the machinist had a different set of assumptions then that they do now. And so there's a different dialogue going back, when it was really manufactured than it is now. And have you investigated that it's kind of a cultural research, but I wonder if that might have been at all helpful in kind of deciphering the blueprints.
Yeah, so a little bit. So I guess for the first question, so I guess I don't do this full time. This is kind of I have a professional job that I do, and this is a side business. So in my professional career, I work for a lighting company. We do kind of high value manufacturing for injection molding, those sorts of things. So I get kind of a good mix of the ultra low volume, super specialty stuff, and then also the oh hey, we're gonna make 1 million of these. So and kind of everywhere in between. So certainly, if there's a part that we can leverage an economy of scale to make it less expensive, we will definitely do that, right? It's just because the volume of Tuckers is just so low, best case scenario, we might get to, a couple of hundred. So generally it doesn't usually make sense to make a tooling investment in order to take that next step. Not to say that, that would never make sense, but we haven't really run into a part yet where at least the things used on other cars we're able to get from somebody that's done them, for that particular car, and we're able to use it on Tucker. So it's kind of worked to our advantage in the reverse to a certain degree. But, yeah, but we haven't had a part that we've got, hey, well, use this Tucker part on your other whatever it might be. So
well, you're not going to make 1 million, but you might make 50 instead of 3.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh yeah, sure. Yep. And we definitely certainly with some even overseas manufacturing and things, it tends to get a little bit less expensive to do some of that stuff. So there are some of the rubber parts and things where we've hit those and particular things that are used, maybe there's 5 of one on a car, and then that ups our production to, like you said, like 100 or 2. Then maybe it makes sense to make a set of tooling for it. But not very often. So it's usually, what's the way we could make this, the single parts are going to be expensive, but at least you don't have to invest in, crazy expensive tooling. The second piece with the blueprint interpretation, I've definitely run into that, where the set of assumptions that were originally used to make the car or the part don't match particularly what the drawing is. And even the way the drawings are made, right? So almost all of them are done fractionally. So when you try to draw it in CAD, what I mean is, 16ths, 30 seconds, those sorts of things. So when you're making these kind of complex, some of the rubber parts and certainly some of the body panels and things like that, when you're using the measurements, they just don't work. Like the math doesn't work. So you hit the point that clearly the machinist making it originally hit and went, hey, wait a minute, this doesn't work. So those are they're kind of cool moments, to be honest, where it's you go, oh, hey, I had to figure this out too. But it's and that's kind of the point I was trying to make on the blueprints, is it's not just like an instruction manual where you just plug the stuff in and it works, right? So there's a set of interpretation that has to happen in a lot of cases to get a part that actually works. So yeah, I don't know if that answered your question or not, but
no, that's perfect answer. Thank you very much.
Yeah, sure.
I think
anyone
Kingsley
else?
has a question. Kingsley does. Unmute, Kingsley.
Unmute, Kingsley. Okay. What do you replace the lead with?
So we use, we kind of have to, this is a struggle on every car where we go, we've got that huge amount of space to take up, right? So a lot of what we do is trying to, where possible, rework the original sheet metal to a point where we can minimize the amount of filler. So we're using generally modern plastic fillers that to replace the lead, but we're kind of not trying to use them the same way the lead was originally used, where they, they're making up gaps of 3/4 of an inch around door panels and things like that to get to the gap. It just, if we tried to do that, even if we tried to do that in lead, it's just not really structurally sound, So when we get a car in, you can see the lead is all cracked and things like that. And that's what we're trying to avoid. So we're reworking the original metal where possible, and where we can't do that, we're replacing with modern sheet metal to get it to a point where we can put what we kind of think about as a responsible amount of body filler in. We're certainly capable of metal finishing it to the point where we don't need any filler. But we do the other part of Rob's business is super high end hot rods, and that's kind of what we're trying to avoid, is make it look like a hot rod. So we still want it to look like a car that was built in 1948. So it's we have this debate on every single car we do. If it's the tough part is, where do you stop? Because you can make it perfect, but that's that doesn't really represent what they were. So.
Okay. Well, Sean, thank you. That was great.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks,
Fantastic.
Sean. Yeah, great. Yeah.
Thank you for being an audience. I'm always happy to talk about Tucker. So.
Yeah. I'm sure Steve is.
It never gets old.
Great.